Hi everyone, so it's Scott. I wanted to tell you how thoughtful I thought so many of your questions were in your study guide forum posts. I've looked through them all, and I posted the questions where I say I thought there was something strong about the question, something where maybe you could elaborate in your midterm. Just anything that I thought was a juicy question and open for interpretation. I let you know what those questions were. I posted them both in the news forum as well as in the midterm study guide post, so you should be able to find them. And then also I'm going to just go through some of them now. And on the midterm, there are going to be 15 questions. 10 of them are going to come from the study guide forum, the posts. And 5 of them will be questions that were not raised in the posts. And then you're going to have some extra credit questions as well. All the questions are going to be a short answer, meaning a well-developed paragraph. I'm going to give you a lot of time to respond. You're going to have a total of 3 hours. You won't need all that time, but I'm going to put it up there anyway. What I would do as you're taking your midterm is work on a document and then paste it in. I say to save your answers on a document because I wouldn't want something to happen where you submit it and you lose your answers, which has happened before. It shouldn't happen, but it's happened before. So as you're writing out your responses, you might want to do it in a separate Word doc. Let me go through your questions. So I'm going to start with Hawthorne. The minister's black veil received about 5 questions that I really liked. Question number 1, do you think Hooper was trying to cover up his sin with the veil? There's a lot here about the veil. We don't know. We have an idea of what it is. It could be his own, representing his own sin, Hooper's own sin, or it could be something representing universal sin. We're not explicitly told that. And, you know, don't forget that it says that it's a parable. And a parable is a story which is illustrating a lesson or a universal truth or a morality. Like a moral tale. And so in that could be part of the reason why he is a little bit open-ended or ambiguous with some of the details in his story. So you might think about, what does the veil represent? Does it represent his sin? Does it represent universal sin? Do you think that the story would be any different if we knew for certain one way or another? So if he came into his congregation and he says, I'm wearing a veil and it's representing universal sin, how would that change the story? So someone asks that. This is Selena asks, do you agree or disagree that if Hooper had directly revealed his purpose in wearing the veil, the story would have lost its significance? Why or why not? So that's one that I'm leaning towards. I really like that. Omar says, defend Mr. Hooper's final words at the end of the story when he cries he would never remove the veil. Do you think he should have removed the veil? So think about him in that deathbed scene where still he refuses to remove the veil. And what do you think of that moment? Veronica asks about the color black and what black represents. And you might think about Hawthorne's use of color in both The Minister's Black Veil and in Young Goodman Brown. Both of them have a lot of blackness in them. Young Goodman Brown, you have Faith's pink ribbon. So color is really important in both of the Hawthorne tales. So you might think about what that the blackness of the veil, what it might represent. And also think about once Hooper's wearing that black veil, everything he's seeing is seen through that blackness, through the veil. So what does that color tell you about the way he views his surroundings and the people around him? Selena asks, how might the story's impact have changed if it was written in first-person narration? That's a really interesting question, and one that you might consider. What if it were narrated directly by Hooper? Okay, so give that some thought. Okay, Young Goodman Brown, Hannah asks, how is the theme of innocence portrayed in the story? So you might think about faith, you might think about Sabbath, you might think, you might look at description, setting, color, all those things when thinking about how innocence is depicted in Young Goodman Brown. Aaliyah asks, why do you think Hawthorne left it unclear as to whether the events occurred in a dream or in reality? So there again, just like within Minister's Black Veil and Young Goodman Brown, there's always some open-endedness, some room for interpretation. Why do you think he left it unclear at the end? So I like that question as well. We're going to move on to the yellow wallpaper. I think the yellow wallpaper received the most questions of all the stories. Rylan asks, what's the significant about the wallpaper? Why is it relevant to the story? He also asks, why do you think the color yellow? And so you might fold that into, or if I ask this question, that could be part of your response, is what you think yellow symbolizes, or why yellow is significant. Janai and Haley ask similar questions about the wallpaper. So that's 3 people asking about the wallpaper. So I'll give that some consideration. Janet asks, what does the narrator mean when she says, I don't want anybody to get that woman out at night but myself? How does her expression convey frustration? So I can see asking you about that phrase, about that section. And then Janet also asks, what does the narrator reveal in the novel that helps understand that she's suffering from postpartum depression? So if I ask something about that, first of all, I wouldn't say that she is suffering from postpartum depression. I think that there are indicators that could be, but there's no definitive, this is postpartum depression. So I would ask you whether or not you think that's what's happening, and if so, why or why not. Daniel says, decide if the narrator's husband acted to the best of his knowledge to treat her. Explain your answer. And I can see asking some variation on that question. Do you think the husband had good intentions? What are the indicators? How might the story be different if the narrator had faced no opposition to her journal entries? So we see that her husband, John, is really stifling everything that she wants to do. She wants to be on the bottom floor. No, John wants her on the top floor, kind of isolated from everybody else. She would like to write in her journal. No, that's too much work. What do you think if she didn't have that kind of opposition? Why is it important to her to be able to write in her journal? She's reluctant to disobey John, but at the same time, she sees that this is a need for her, and it's almost like a little silent rebellion when she's writing in her journal. Why do you think that writing in the journal was so important to her? Tyler says, do you agree with the compliance that the narrator showed with her husband, doctor's treatment? And I would ask you, why do you think she complies? And this is something that I've responded to within many people in response to many people's essays, but also on the discussion board forum. But what do you think? Mackenzie says, what do you think she meant when she said, I've pulled off most of the paper, so you can't put me back? I like that question. So I might think about taking one of the phrases that you're coming up with and asking. So Janet has a quotation and Mackenzie has a quotation. So you might think before you take the test about those two quotes. Selena says, in what ways does John's treatment of the narrator force her into becoming insane at the end of the story? A lot of people see her, oops, my phone is ringing, so I apologize about that. A lot of you in your writing have called her insane. Do you think that she starts off that way, or is she driven to madness throughout the story? And if you think she's driven insane or to the point of madness, support that and tell me why. Okay, Melville, nobody asked any questions about Bartleby the Scrivener, so that might be one of my own questions to you. So remember, 10 of the questions are going to come from your posts, and then there's going to be a section where I ask you 5 of my own questions. And so since no one brought up Melville, that might be one of my 5. Now, you might have questions about Melville, the story. If it confused you at all, ask some questions, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you post. Okay, moving on to Poe. The Telltale Heart, there were 2 questions. Joanna says, do you think the narrator is reliable or unreliable? Okay, and I think you know what I think about this. I've posted it in the news forum. I mean, not in the news forum, in the discussion boards and to many of your, in response to many of your papers. How does Edgar Allan Poe's writing style make the story more suspenseful? So I would say, what kinds of things does create suspense? Think about his use of silence and sound in his stories. Think about his use of repetition in the stories. Think about his use of omission. Think about where something's going to happen and things get delayed. How does he build suspense? So I might think about asking something like that. Cask of Amontillado had about 5 questions. Again, Montresor, do you think he's a reliable narrator or not a reliable narrator? That came up from 2 of the students. Elvis says, what was the narrator's name? And I can see asking you about the significance of names in that story. So for instance, Montresor, my treasure, and Fortunato, clearly wasn't very fortunate in the story. Not only what do the names mean, but why do you think how was he using the names? Was he using it to create a sense of irony, humor? What do you think about the names? Elvis asks, what if Montresor gave Fortunato a quick and painless death at the end of the story? Would you still characterize him the same way? Would you still think of him as a lunatic? So I can see asking something along those lines, maybe with some slight variation. Emily asks about the costume that Fortunato wears, and Veronica asks about the use of the carnival. So in your book, you'll see this right at the very beginning of the story. We see on page 543, it was about dusk one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season, so that I encountered my friend. Why is he using the carnival season as the backdrop? To what effect? And then in terms of how he's dressed, he accosted me with excessive warmth, for he had been drinking much. The man wore motley. He had on a tight-fitting party-striped dress, and his head was surrounded by the conical cap and bells, almost like a jester. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should never have done wringing his hand. Think about the bells, how the bells are used in the story. The first time that we hear the bells, there's something kind of comical about it. The second time that you hear the bells, there's something horrific about it the second time we hear it. Think about how your feelings about the bells change. But for this, it's just asking you, what do you think about his use of that costume? So you might think about Fortunato's, what he's wearing, and the background of the carnival season. What is Poe trying to evoke or create there? Okay. Now we're going to move on to Flannery O'Connor. I'm hoping this is helpful. We had 2 questions about Good Country People. Do you agree that Good Country People is a cynical story? That's Joanna asks that. And that's interesting. Certainly we have Joy Holga, who herself is kind of a cynical character. She's a very guarded character. We have other characters who are kind of mean-spirited characters like Pointer. We have Mrs. Hopewell. All of these characters, are complicated characters. I would say Pointer less so than the others, but even if you think Joy and Holga might be kind of a cynical, has a cynical point of view at times, do you see the story as being cynical? What do you think? I'm interested in that. And then, of course, you'd have to support that. Janai asks, why did Joy legally change her name at the age of 21? So, you know, that's where we get from Joy to Holga. You might think of it as a kind of defense mechanism or a way of protecting herself. Why do you think the name change? A good man is hard to find. We had 4 people asking the same question, so I'll give it some serious consideration. What does the grandmother mean by "you're one of my children"? And this happens at the very end of the story. It's on page 508. This is with the grandmother and the misfit. And this is after the family has been dragged out into the woods and shot. The misfit said, I wished I had have been there. He said, hitting the ground with his fist. It ain't right I wasn't there, because if I had have been there, I would have known. Listen, lady, he said in a high voice, if I had been there, I would have known, and I wouldn't be like I am now. His voice seemed about to crack, and the grandmother's head cleared for an instant. She saw the man's face twisted close to her own, as if he were going to cry, and she murmured, why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children. She reached out and touched him on the shoulder. The misfit sprang back as if a snake had bitten him and shot her 3 times through the chest. Then he put his gun down on the ground and took off his glasses and began to clean them. Why do you think, she says, you're like one of my own children in that section? Let's see, Kavya asks, do you agree or disagree that the grandmother gets redeemed at the end? Elvis says, how do you explain the grandmother's smile at the end of the story? And so here's the quote. It says, Hiram and Bobby Lee returned from the woods and stood over the ditch, looking down at the grandmother, who half sat and half lay in a puddle of blood with her legs crossed under her like a child's and her face smiling up at the cloudless sky. What do you make of that smiling up? And that's what Elvis is asking. So I could see asking something like that. Joanna says, do you agree that the grandmother was not acting selfishly? And we can flip that. Do you think she was acting selfishly? And I think most of you have characterized her as a selfish character. Why do you think it was important to the grandmother for people to know she was a lady? And this is something a lot of you have written about, so you might think about this. And in studying, you might look at your writings. If you wrote about this story, you might look at some of the discussion board posts, get other people's perspectives. I'm really interested in your own perspective, but if you want to see what the dialogue has been around that, you might look. At the end of the story, the grandmother claims the misfit and her are related. She claims he is her son. What do you think about that? So that goes back to that previous "You are my child" quote. James Joyce, Araby, no questions were asked, so I will probably ask you one in my section. So I'll probably so far ask you one based on Melville and one based on Joyce. In terms of Eudora Welty, A Worn Path, there were about 6 questions that I was looking at. A lot of them had to do with the setting of the story. How did the weather impact the story? How did the landscape, the setting? Selena asks, how does the setting influence Phoenix's trip through the forest? Why is this significant? Haley asks a similar question, so I'll probably think about that because 3 people have asked something regarding the setting in A Worn Path. Haley asks what if we were told whether the grandson in A Worn Path were alive or not? How would that change the meaning of the story? Selena asks a similar question. She says, defend whether or not you believe that Phoenix's grandson is alive. So she's been on this trek, on this path throughout the story, and we get her in the doctor's office towards the end of the story, and the nurse says, tell us quickly about your grandson and get it over. He isn't dead, is he? So that's floated out there, and so look at her response. Tell me what you think. Tyler asks a general question about how would you describe Phoenix's character. I can see asking something like that. And let's see. Haley asks, how does the way other characters talk or behave towards Phoenix, what does that reflect on our society about attitudes towards the toward the elderly? You could also think we could expand that towards blacks, minorities, towards the poor. But Haley is specifically asking about elders. So I'll think about something like that. I might expand it. Okay, Grace Paley, A Conversation with My Father. We've got a couple questions there. Why does the narrator despise the kind of plot her father wants to write? And I said that I can see asking the reverse. Why does the father reject the kinds of stories his daughter wants to write or writes? Do you agree or disagree that the argument between the narrator and his father is representative of her unwillingness to accept his fate? I think the father says it's her unwillingness to look tragedy square on. Kavya is saying to accept her fate. What do you think is being said? Now, Gerard Manley Hopkins, you have 3 poems. Nobody asked any questions. Look over those 3 poems. Ask some direct questions. If you are reading them and you're confused in any way, just ask questions, and I will do my best to respond to you, tonight, tomorrow, before you take the midterm. If there's something that's where you feel stuck, just ask. Emily Dickinson, one of the poems that was looked at was A Narrow Fellow in the Grass. This is from Aaliyah. She says, some people believe the poem describes a frightening experience, while other people believe the poem describes an enjoyable experience. What do you think? And if I ask you that question, I, of course, would ask you to support your response. So I could see that being one of the 10. I could also see when it comes to my own 5, asking you about one of her other poems as well. I'm leaning towards a certain slant of light. I'm not sure yet, though. Wallace Stevens, no questions were asked, so that again is something that's that I might come up with. Robert Frost, birches. There was a lot written about birches in the discussion board post, so you might look at that. Again, if you have any questions about birches, just ask. There's a phrase, if you don't open your mouth, you won't get fed. So if you're seeking support for any of these poems, let me know and I'll respond. T.S. Eliot, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Veronica asks a couple questions. She says, who is the you in the poem? The poem starts this way. It says, let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. So who's the you that we're talking about, you and I? So I can see asking that. She says, why does the narrator keep repeating, and indeed there will be time? Time for decisions and revisions and indecisions. And there's a lot of play with Ecclesiastes, which says a time to be born, a time to die, a time to this, a time to that. So there's all this, oh, there's time, almost like postponing. There's going to be time. Why do you think all that repetition of that idea of there will be time? Veronica also asks, is he calling himself the fool? So let me lead you to the stanza she's talking about. Prufrock says, no, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. I'm an attendant lord, one that will do to swell a progress, start a scene or two, advise the prince, no doubt, an easy tool, deferential, glad to be of use, politic, cautious, and meticulous, full of high sentence, but a bit obtuse, at times indeed almost ridiculous, almost at times the fool. Right? A lot of this poem has to do with insecurity and anxiety, and maybe even some feelings of insignificance. A lot of it has to do with social anxiety. And he says, I'm not the star of the play. I'm not Prince Hamlet. I might be someone in there that will kind of help move the scene along. Maybe I'm the fool. So what do you think he's saying there? What does that mean? In The Great Gatsby, a lot of you were asking questions that had to do with sections of the novel that we haven't gotten to yet as a class. So I kind of whittled it down to a couple questions. Hannah says, do you support Nick's stance of not telling his cousin Daisy about the affair Tom is having with Myrtle? Why or why not? Why do you think Nick kind of holds this in? What does that tell us about Nick? And then Veronica R. asks, the introduction of Myrtle and George Wilson underscores the importance of social class in the novel. How does their presence sharpen Fitzgerald's characterization of the rich, and what might the resulting contrast suggest about the role of class in shaping social experience in The Great Gatsby? So I can see asking about issues of class in The Great Gatsby, and maybe even specifically something about the introduction of Myrtle and George Wilson. So those are some of the questions from your study guide that I'm looking at, and think about those questions before you open the midterm. So the midterm, once you open the midterm, you're going to have 3 hours. Like I said, you have to do it in one sitting. You can't start it, stop, log off, and then log back on. If you log off or if you're away from it for too long, it's going to close down or wipe out your answer. So once you're doing it, you've got to do it for the full 3 hours, okay? I wouldn't, as I was saying, you could save some of your answers on a Word doc, just so if you submit it, you don't want to lose anything. I just want to mention that again and reinforce that. And if there are any questions, just feel free to ask. So again, you're gonna have 15 questions, and I'm gonna give you like maybe about 5 extra credit questions. So if you have time, I would ask the 5 extra credit questions. All I ask is that your responses be developed, at least a paragraph long, for the most part, and supported with the text. And again, you're gonna have a long time to work on these answers. So if you have any questions before the midterm starts, please let me know, and I hope this was helpful. And if it was helpful, maybe we can do this again. Again, if there's any text where you need some support, just ask. You can post it in the Questions Cafe, and I'll be looking at that Questions Cafe pretty diligently tonight, tomorrow, up through the midterm. So thanks a lot, and I'll talk with you all soon.